Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Oberklaid, and I'm a research analyst at AHURI. I'm delighted to welcome you to the AHURI Research webinar series. For those who don't know us, AHURI is the only organisation in Australia dedicated exclusively to housing, homelessness, cities and urban research. Through our national network of university partners, we undertake research that supports policy development at all levels of government, assists industry in improving practice, and informs the broader community, highlighting credible evidence-based solutions. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all joining us from today, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal people and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters throughout Australia. I'd like to remind you that AHURI publishes new research regularly and announces it on our e-newsletter, AHURI News, and on social media accounts. You can keep up to date with all of our research and events by reading AHURI News or following us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X. Before I introduce today's topic and speakers, I have a few housekeeping messages. This webinar is being recorded, so if you want to return to it later or forward it on to a colleague, the recording will be on the AHURI On Demand channel of our website in the coming days. At the end of this webinar, you'll receive a survey, and we welcome your feedback so we can continue to improve our webinar program. We've opened up the chat function, so if you'd like to share your thoughts with other participants, you can do so, and this can be found on the right of the presentation screen. Now let's focus on today's topic and presenters. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, Hidden Costs, Measuring the Real Affordability of Housing. Our presenter today is Dr. Adam Crowe, Research Fellow at Curtin University. Adam is the lead author of AHURI's report, Measuring Housing Affordability, Scoping the Real Cost of Housing. The report, along with a short policy evidence summary and standalone executive summary, are now available on the AHURI website, as well as in the handout section to the right of your screen. Adam's research focuses on urban living and housing dynamics, with a particular emphasis on accessibility, affordability, and sustainability. Adam researches and writes on the evolving landscape of cities, driven by concerns about urban equity, climate resilience, and unmet housing needs of vulnerable populations. We also welcome Professor Rob Stokes. Rob is an urbanist and industry professor for ESG at Macquarie University. Currently serving on the Australian Government Urban Policy Forum, Rob was the first ever Minister for Public Spaces and Australia's first ever Minister for Active Transport. Rob also served as Minister for Planning, Cities, Infrastructure, Transport, Education, Environment and Heritage in New South Wales in a parliamentary career over 16 years. Today's webinar will run for an hour. First, we'll have a presentation from Adam about the research and its key findings. We'll then bring Rob into the discussion, informed by some of the questions that you sent in when you registered. And we'll also try to respond to questions as you enter them into the chat as time allows throughout the discussion. That's enough from me, so over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Sarah, and hi, everyone. I'd like to take a moment to thank AHURI for funding this project and my postdoctoral fellowship. And I'd also like to acknowledge my co-author, Professor Stephen Rowley, who has provided incredible support and mentorship. So this research was designed to scope the often overlooked aspects of housing affordability in terms of energy and transport costs, as well as the quality and location of dwellings. So I'm using the word scope as the aim was to bring together largely siloed areas of research and policy relating to the affordability, spatial and quality dimensions of housing. So to set some context for today's discussion, housing affordability in Australia is largely understood as the relationship between direct housing costs, so mortgages or rents, and household income. Housing costs that exceed a certain share of income represent housing stress, which in our policy context is defined as the lowest 40% of income earners spending more than 30% of income on housing. as that proportion of income dedicated to housing increases, challenges associated with poor affordability typically become more pronounced and severe. At the same time, existing research has long shown that this measurement of housing stress can actually underestimate the wider cost, health, and well-being implications to households. So, for example, it's largely insensitive to factors such as household size, composition, and even household formation, housing tenure and housing quality, location, and neighbourhood characteristics. These multiple factors, they intersect, compound, and impact households unevenly, yet the decisions households make to manage their housing costs, they remain largely unaccounted for in current housing affordability metrics, which can lead to misleading conclusions about what is truly affordable. So against this background, the research was commissioned to consider these broader dimensions of housing. It was recognised that very few studies have collectively examined the implications of the trade-offs made when making housing decisions. And so then the research sought to explore this and was guided by the following three questions. So how does the housing quality location nexus affect household expenditure, health, and well-being? To what extent does existing policy address these broader housing affordability issues? And how could a more robust approach to housing affordability be developed? To address these questions, we scoped government policy and practice targeting these multiple dimensions of housing affordability. And we also scoped a range of existing Australian studies to identify a suite of methodologies and data sets used that could be further developed or scaled up to improve our understanding of that housing quality location nexus. And so taken together, the key findings and policy recommendations, they offer critical insight as to how we could better measure housing affordability, but also develop appropriate policy responses to them. So to set the scene, it's worth re-emphasising that many lower income households make difficult trade-offs to secure housing. This could be deciding between heating or cooling their home to stay healthy, buying groceries, or living within proximity to key amenities, resources, and social networks, so family and friends. But these trade-offs, they can also result in experiences of material deprivation and poverty, health and well-being implications, social exclusion, and transportation or commuting hardship. So to unpack this, we explored the relationship between housing quality and affordability first. In this report, we define housing quality in terms of both habitability and also thermal or environmental performance. Housing affordability challenges can force some households into physically inadequate housing. And our findings show that lower income households routinely make difficult trade-offs between their energy consumption, for example, and meeting other essential household expenditures. So this can result in energy hardship, which can have adverse health effects. So the types of energy hardship can include being unable to pay bills, rationing energy to the detriment of health and well-being, and also spending a higher proportion of income on energy to the detriment of consuming other essential goods and services. But importantly, households can experience those three forms of hardship simultaneously. And this is often compounded by the fact that lower income households tend to reside in housing of lower quality and poorer energy efficiency. We also observed a clear tenure dimension. So we found that renters are more likely to reside in substandard housing and spend more on energy compared to owner-occupiers. But at the same time, renters have little agency to improve the material conditions of their home. So fear of landlord retaliation, for example, can deter renters from requesting basic repairs, maintenance, or improvements. And this creates a culture of accepting substandard housing where renters bear both those associated financial and health costs. However, there have been some promising improvement to increase housing quality and energy performance in recent years, namely the 2022 changes to the National Construction Code, which aim to enhance the livability of new homes, making them more accessible and comfortable to live in. And this has been achieved through increasing energy efficiency requirements from 6 to 7 NatHERS stars, and also the new livable housing design standards to ensure that homes are more accessible to older people, people with disability, families with young children, for example. While these changes certainly have the potential to improve dwelling standards, they do not apply to existing homes. And as highlighted in this table, there is jurisdictional variation in minimum performance requirements, which are also being implemented at varying dates. So for instance, the 7-star requirements have not been adopted everywhere, and some states have not adopted the livable housing design requirements to improve accessibility. We also explored the interaction between housing location and affordability. So across Australia's urban environment, accessibility to essential resources is spatially varied and unevenly concentrated within inner urban areas where housing tends to be more expensive. And this can result in lower income households being pressured to consume housing in underserviced locations. So what I mean by this is lower amenity areas that are spatially dislocated from major activity and employment centres. And this can isolate residents from job opportunities, education, essential services and social connections, and result in higher transportation costs, extensive commute times, and the subsequent health outcomes associated with those burdens. In terms of addressing spatial inequality, governments have committed to increasing new housing supply with a focus on infill development, and that's to promote sustainability and livability, to reduce urban sprawl, and to maximise the use of existing infrastructure. While infill targets exist across all the major capital cities, longitudinal ABS data shows that these targets are not being met across the board, and in some jurisdictions they're actually regressing. Moreover, while strategic land use policy, such as inclusionary zoning, while inclusionary zoning has been effective in addressing locational disadvantage in comparator countries, as this table illustrates, it's rarely practiced in Australia, with the exception of select urban areas. More broadly, policies supporting affordability across the housing quality location nexus, they vary by jurisdiction and intended target cohort. So some of the key policy measures that we identified include the National Construction Code updates, which I discussed, which apply to new build only. So this means that the quality of existing dwellings, it's not likely to improve without targeted intervention. And as previously discussed, fewer measures directly apply a spatial focus to housing affordability, and fewer focus on targeting the private rental sector. So taken together, Our findings, they underscore the need to first take the quality and locational dimensions of housing affordability more seriously in policy discourse, but also across industry and community conversations. Some of the key policy recommendations derived from this research include the potential to implement mandatory disclosure of environmental performance in residential homes, increasing the minimum housing standards across the continuum, so across the varying tenures, developing more proactive responses to targeting the root causes of energy hardship, so not only short-term, time-limited bill relief. And then there's also that critical need to better consider the spatial dimensions of housing affordability. So here, land use planning mechanisms such as inclusionary zoning, coupled with expanded transport accessibility and assistance schemes, particularly to low to moderate income households, could begin to address the widening locational disadvantages experienced across Australia as the population grows and the urban footprint expands. So I'm going to wrap this up here so we can move into the discussion. But I would like to end by stressing that the relationship between housing affordability, quality, and location, it is fundamental to household health, well-being, and life satisfaction. Yet, as illustrated in our scoping study, these essential life domains, they can place competing pressures on household budgets, which can have significant health, psychological, social, locational, and employment implications, particularly at that lower end of the income spectrum. So developing a more holistic understanding and measurement of housing affordability, it's essential to provide better living conditions and opportunities for all Australians. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Adam. It's incredible to see you synthesise your research into just a few minutes of a presentation. Rob, I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on this research. And I guess in your time as Minister, did you feel that there was this need for more robust, more nuanced measures to help inform your decision making?
Yes. And the first thing I'd like to do is congratulate both Adam and Stephen for, as you elegantly put it, a really, making the complex look easy. The synthesis of bringing together the sort of some of the spatial quality and efficiency aspects of affordability, because as your research starts with, these things are often siloed, and always the challenge that government has is there's always the temptation to listen to the loudest or the squeakiest wheel, and that was of particularly either speculative developers or volume builders who were only focused on capital cost. The recurrent costs. I remember in New South Wales when we experimented with changing our design and efficiency rules around new development in a particular state environmental planning policy. We got a piece of a cost-benefit analysis done that demonstrated that quality improvements dramatically. The benefits outweighed the costs, but the development industry was quite open with this and said, well, yeah, that's fine, but it doesn't help us because we bear the upfront costs and we don't reap the long-term benefits, which I thought was sort of very honest, but pretty sad. But the consumer doesn't actually account for those benefits in the initial purchase. Or signing up for a lease, that those longer term benefits aren't costed. And a policymaker from overseas said to me, looking at Australia, which is what this research also points out, is Australians always make acquisitions on the basis of the sticker price. They don't look at the recurrent costs. And as your research indicates, that's demonstrated in housing particularly painfully because the costs are so high. But these operational costs ultimately are borne by society. You make a great point about some of the some of the unintended consequences of well-meaning subsidies for energy bills, which actually, in one sense, as your research points out, makes the problem worse because it treats the symptoms and not the cause, which relates to the efficiency of the building itself in terms of its energy performance. So we're treating the symptoms, not the cause. And I thought that was in summary, this is incredibly powerful research. It is a scoping study, so it leads to a lot of the questions. And I thought the summary at the end, where you pointed to what the implications for changing policy might be, one that I'd add to that would be also what incentives could be put in place to deal with the vast bulk of the existing stock where the problem's already been created. So how do we retrofit the wicked problems that have been created by policy failings of the past, as well as making sure that we build properly into the future? And the other one I'd add is you quite accurately point to the NCC as being the device whereby governments can be held to account to act collectively. The problem is, and my own state is an example of it, the design quality elements of the NCC, and New South Wales didn't sign up, Victoria didn't sign up, so it puts pressures on the other states. Once one breaks ranks, it's very hard for the other states to maintain the collective force toward increasing building standards, because as we hear, quite appropriately, we have a housing crisis. But in light, whenever we introduce these things, my lived experience is there's always a reason. The development industry will always say now's the wrong time. There'll never be a right time to introduce these sorts of reforms.
Rob, perhaps before we go on to further conversation, I am quite interested in those points that you raise around particular voices or the perspective of particular states sort of not allowing for change. How do you sort of deconcentrate some of that power, and what's the role of the broader housing industry in sort of pushing us in the right direction?
I think the answer for policymakers is to learn from industry. Industry work collectively, so they don't break ranks with one another when they push their positions, and they're perfectly entitled to do so. But the way that the current housing crisis is described by industry would make you think that the only thing we need to do is just to build more houses and we'll sort out the problem. And actually, by any increase in quality standards for housing, that'll just drive up the cost of housing more and make it less feasible, so it'll make the problem worse. So we as policymakers and as governments all need to work collectively, because that's how the other side are working. And when I say the other side, hopefully we're all aiming to get the same thing done, but collectively learn from the development industry. They work collectively on these things, and as a result, they get to describe what the housing crisis is and the solutions to it. And we're seeing, in South Australia, New South Wales at the moment, I looked this up to quote it. There was some recent work by the New South Wales Productivity Commissioner that where he argued in his recent report that rules around access to sunlight, ventilation, storage, balcony size and family size apartments are unnecessary. And I quote from his report, quote, "Consumers are well placed to decide which of these features they are willing to pay for and which are worth foregoing to live in a more attractive location." So in other words, I guess if you don't want flushing toilets, that should be a matter for the consumer and who is government to tell them what they should want. So this is the sort of rhetoric that needs to be unpacked and responded to collectively. And that's why the NCC is a powerful tool, but it's only as powerful as people sign up to it. And perhaps a policy intervention that the federal government might want to look at would be, big amounts of money are going around to support the delivery of affordable and social housing. Maybe a precondition in the procurement process for that is, by the way, when you deliver this housing, in order to apply for it, you need to sign up to the latest NCC requirements around building sustainability. That might be a good thing for the federal government to use its spending power to drive a policy response by the states.
Great, thanks. I think, Adam, I'm keen to hear sort of your thoughts on those potential policy levers, incentives and otherwise that might help us lift our standard and quality of housing, and what you uncovered through your research.
Absolutely. And thanks so much, Rob, for those really good insights and additions in terms of potential policy implications of this research and the topic we were looking at. I would just add to that in terms of from the industry perspective of say improving the quality of dwellings, actually leveling the playing field through having for example, mandatory disclosure of energy performance like we do in the commercial sector, and having a minimum standard of housing across the board can really help to get industry on board, because it starts to infiltrate price. As we've seen in international jurisdictions, is that, for example, across the European Union, there is a green price premium per se for really well-performing homes, and therefore homes that are not performing well thermally and environmentally, they are below market rates. We currently don't really see that disparity to a certain extent in Australia, and that has a lot to do with consumers not being appropriately informed about what they're purchasing. We know more. We have more information about buying appliances or a car in terms of what it's going to cost us in the long run, and what the performance is going to be compared to the housing in which we live. So I think the mandatory disclosure and minimum standards, those two mechanisms could really help not only to improve housing outcomes for people, but help to level that playing field to get industry on board, to allow those supply chains to be changed to whatever they need to be to ensure that the appropriate materials, design is implemented to achieve those higher performing housing.
We've got a couple of questions as well that have come through just around how some of those sort of policies are sort of targeted toward renters, and so the impact of split incentives. And so you've got landlords who are investing in the quality, but the benefit flows potentially to the occupant of the dwelling, and so the impact of residents not living in comfortable accommodation. So Rob, I'm keen to hear your thoughts first on how we could potentially target the rental market.
Yeah, well, again, you've got to come up with some way of valuing housing that looks temporally, not just locationally, but at the cost of housing, of the operational cost of housing over time, and our whole system is garnered to, or our whole legal system is focused around the rights of owners, and only in a subsidiary sense those to whom owners have a responsibility through a lease. So, and it's interesting actually, just referring back to the Productivity Commission report, talks about consumers, meaning the house buyer. There doesn't seem to be a focus on the people who rent the houses. So to that extent, particularly given the maturation of the community housing sector, maybe we need to look at the responsibility being with the community housing provider as the owner. And so to try and pierce that and look directly at the tenants becomes difficult, because then you've got issues. If you're trying to, for example, set up arrangements for affordable electricity for a direct power purchase agreement, for example, or a cheaper, more affordable way of doing energy, you run into problems of third line forcing, because then the tenant doesn't get to choose their energy provider. And I'm hearing anecdotally that that's happening where tenants are getting locked into very expensive energy agreements because it's cheaper for a developer to enter into an agreement to provide some of this infrastructure, which the costs then get passed on. So I don't know what the the mechanism would be, I suspect our strata laws are not fit for purpose anymore. This is not an area of special policy specialty to me, but I was always alarmed that strata was always developed when, in the 60s for when it was a 4-pack or a 6-pack, and now we've got sort of 500 to 1,000 units in some developments, and so the strata is trying to do things it was never designed to do, and looking after the interests of tenants in that situation, and some of the experience of multifamily in the US. It all starts great, but then over time, it becomes very difficult to ensure that the interests of tenants are properly addressed. So I don't. Yeah, that's a long way of saying I don't know what the answer is.
Adam, do you have any reflections?
Yeah, and I completely agree with you, Rob, in terms of the emphasis required on that temporality, the temporal dimensions. Look, there are some retrofit policy mechanisms that are increasing the performance of existing dwellings, particularly across the social housing space. So each state and territory have implemented, committed significant funding to retrofitting, improving the quality of existing stock, in addition to building high quality new stock as well. Sarah, you mentioned it at the top of this question, the private rental sector is a very difficult tenure to improve that quality with that split disincentive. What the research shows is there's a need for that right balance of incentives and regulations for housing providers. So a carrot and stick type approach. Look, we are seeing some progress on this front. For example, in the Victorian context, they have set new energy efficiency and habitability standards for rental properties. I don't know if there's been any kind of preliminary research done on how that's starting to progress and factor into the rental system in terms of prices, for example, retrofits, and the actual experience of renters. But I think that's certainly a space to keep an eye on, and hopefully we'll start to see more of that across the board. I know that there's some minimum standards across the rental space in Queensland that are being proposed, and some minor measures that have been implemented in Western Australia as well. But it's not just increasing the standards of habitability, like the habitability of the home, but it's also the actual environmental performance, so the energy performance and thermal performance. Yeah.
And that's one of the really interesting things you and Stephen do look at, is this sort of, whether as part of vendor disclosure or lessor disclosure, that you have to provide a certificate of performance, which they do in other jurisdictions. And it would have to be done at a state or territory basis here, because that's how the property law works. And maybe that will change the culture over time, because I suspect if you told people, what their energy bills were going to be, they probably, at the moment, wouldn't take terribly much notice of it. It probably wouldn't impact. And that's what the developers were telling me, because that was when we tried to introduce what is called the designer play set in New South Wales. They were saying, well, the benefits aren't reflected in the sticker price that people are prepared to pay. Mm-hmm. But my counter thought was, well, you've got to start, and maybe if we start to measure these things and so the consumer, we change this perception or cultural focus on the sticker price and more on the recurrent price. And as in a cost of living crisis, because it's not just a housing crisis, a cost of living crisis, as energy bills are inexorably increasing, maybe people are going to focus more on these costs over time. So to your point, that's a policy thing that we could do. That, I guess the counter argument would be, it's another piece of red tape. That seems to be the argument against doing anything. But it might over time shift the culture in the way in which we look at the value of our housing stock.
I agree. And I think that, Look, the recent home energy disclosure framework that was proposed by energy ministers in July, that has potential to lead the way in terms of actually having that disclosure of housing performance to inform consumers. But again, it has that multi-pronged benefit of not only benefiting the households themselves, but broader community, the environment, and then hopefully feeding into the industry side of things, where prices are accurately priced into the value of delivering a particular home, or even the sale and rent of a home, like we see in the commercial sector, like we see across many other jurisdictions, high-income countries that have had mandatory disclosure for many years. And also having a record of the performance of our stock, it gives us something to benchmark and to work from, and to work to increase. So, for example, if you've got the very poor performing housing, they can be strategically targeted through whatever types of policy intervention is required to address those really poor performing homes. We know that the majority of Australian housing is sitting at around 2-star NatHERS rating. The new standards are 7. But in terms of households or the consumer having a clear understanding of what the performance is of the home that they are considering buying or renting, that's largely absent. It's removed from the picture in the current setting.
I'm interested in kind of another aspect of consumer choice, just around location. And it seems to be that if you're searching for an affordable option, you just have to keep going further and further out, perhaps, or you're maybe not able to have good quality housing within more inner areas. I'm interested, Adam, in your research, and have you uncovered examples of places elsewhere that have a less siloed approach to integrating planning for housing and jobs and transport and affordable housing? And if so, what sort of levers do you think could be really effective at ensuring affordable housing is well located?
It's a good question, and you're right that there's almost a double disadvantage that can transpire, especially when low to moderate income households are making those difficult trade-offs between, okay, do I enter housing stress to reside in a more amenity-rich, well-connected location, or seek less expensive housing where they're more likely to experience spatial dislocation and varying forms of social exclusion and transportation hardship? What we've seen in our international counterparts and in some specific jurisdictions in Australia is having some form of inclusionary zoning, where particular development over a certain size has a proportion of social or subsidised rental housing, or even affordable home ownership options in that development. There's varying ways that this is applied internationally and even within our own country. It typically comes with needing some type of incentive for private market developers, in this case, to get on board with that, to have a feasible development go through. So we are seeing a lot of those mechanisms in place and delivering that housing diversity. So in terms of tenure diversity, housing that's appropriate for people across the income spectrum in well-located areas. In other jurisdictions, we're only seeing it in select jurisdictions in Australia. Another example is actually on the home front, there are some government commitments that have been made to improving accessibility, connectivity and sustainability throughout the urban environment. There's a scheme here in Western Australia called MetroNet, which aims to promote urban efficiency and better connect housing with employment precincts. So that's through high frequency public transportation systems coupled with mixed use and mixed tenure housing developments around key transport hubs around the entire Greater Perth area. So that's a good example of where the planning, transport, housing areas are coming together to think strategically about, yes, spatial disadvantage is significant. Housing affordability is a major challenge. How do we start to mechanise policy that can aim to address those multiple dimensions of hardship that many Australians are facing?
Rob, we also had a question coming from the audience around how decision makers balance some of those considerations around ensuring that there's affordable housing in high amenity, transport rich areas. Is that politically challenging? Is there a fair amount of...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, look...
How do you navigate that?
Well, so in New South Wales, I introduced the 5 to 10% affordable, and now that looks, very inadequate. But at the time, that was pretty. So I think what I learned, you do it incrementally. You don't try and do everything all at once. Mm-hmm. You create the idea that the expectation that affordable housing is provided is one of the benefits that you get, that the community gets for giving away some development rights. And I think this is a very important argument for politicians to make, but policymakers more generally. That is, development rights are owned by all of us, are owned by the community. If you own a piece of land, you're perfectly entitled to do whatever you were allowed to do with it when you bought it. But if you're seeking to change its use, you've got to ask the community for permission, and the permission gets to click the ticket on the way through for the things that have wider social benefit, like particularly affordable housing. So I think making that case is very, very important, because I think there is a sense, and it's interesting seeing politically the emergence of now a libertarian party, which is this idea that if you own a piece of property, you should be able to do whatever the hell you want with it. And it's got this idea that, well, hang on, private property doesn't give you development rights that you don't otherwise have. They're owned by the community, and if you want to access them, you've got to share them a bit. And so I think that's really important. I think it's also important to understand how the different players in the development sector have different views. Some of the developers own land, some of the developers don't own the land yet, and depending on their perspective, imposing an affordable housing requirement is very different to someone who owns the land to someone who doesn't yet own it. So I think part of the answer to that is when you make policy change, you cast them out into the future a little while, so people have got time to get used to them. And it's easy to say now that I'm not in there, but I think you need to be a bit bold and set out a clear target of what the expectation will be in 5 years. And if that's 30% in a Todd precinct, because the challenge is with solving locational disadvantage by improving transport connectivity, you're creating the gentrification paradox. That is, you're increasing property values and pushing people further out and creating this ongoing problem. So you've got to lock in the ongoing affordable housing, and then that comes to the definition of affordable housing, because if you tie that to discount to market rent, well, you're also increasing market rent by increasing the desirability of these areas. So there's a lot of complexity to it, but I think the first thing is you need to set what's the expectation? If you get a rezoning, how much of that in a well-located area, how much of it is reasonable for that to go to a discounted housing model to people who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford to live in those areas, and that there's a wider social need and interest in making sure that we have a mix of different people in our communities, and making that case to the community. Because the community, it's interesting, in this room, we all know what we're talking about, but the general community thinks, well, hang on, why doesn't that person get a job and they can, earn money and go and buy a house like everyone else? And that's a very ingrained view, and people don't get the nuance. And with respect in their worlds, why would they? They're busy, working at their job. They don't quite understand how can't walk in other people's shoes.
I think, Rob, just to add, breaking down those narratives and the stigma often attached to them is incredibly important. And then just another point that I'd add, in addition to those more kind of direct measures, so say inclusionary zoning, there are a range of more indirect measures, policy measures that could be taken, for example, to help to, for example, promote housing diversity across the, we're talking metropolitan areas, urban areas. That would come through potential planning reform. I know we're definitely seeing some in particular jurisdictions over the past couple of years. Strategic planning reform that is designed to facilitate particularly a range of medium density housing done right, not just the battle axe triplex that we have been witnessing over the past 30, 40 years. But then other mechanisms that potentially make it easier for households to right size as they move along the life course and their housing needs change. That I think how the housing diversity and the ability to right size more, and an example of right sizing would be doing some work around stamp duty and making it more.
We tried that.
Yeah, I don't want to go into the tax side of things too much, but look, if it were easier for let's say an older family, kids have moved out from home, they've got a 5-bedroom home, it's 20k from the city. If they could find a home that was more suitable in their location, so a 2-bedroom home, which that's where the housing diversity conversation comes into it, you'll often find in the middle outer suburbs, it's predominantly 4x2s.
Well, Adam, the more I looked at planning, law and policy, I keep coming back to tax. That if we, maybe these discussions always end up talking about tax, but Henry George told us how to do it 120 years ago or whatever. A broad-based land tax will help people to make the right decisions, we sort of figured that out exactly at the same time as mass suburbanisation started, and suddenly everyone had skin in the game, and so it was in no one's interests individually to have a broad-based land tax. But those sorts of things, and it's, I'd encourage policymakers to think that to deal with some of these problems, constantly it seems that the horse to flog is the planning system. But I think ultimately, and we're already seeing it, we're now seeing, the planning system is producing all these sorts of opportunities, but the development industry saying, but none of them are feasible. So ultimately, I suspect in a couple of years, we're going to figure out the planning system's not ultimately responsible. But the sooner we start to look at some of the tax impediments to people making sensible decisions, the better. But it's going to be hard for all of us collectively to do that.
Absolutely, and there has been some really good research done around Australia looking at the the potentiality of a land tax-based approach. One of the things that's often raised as a point of caution, and it draws on some of the US state experiences where they use a land tax system, is that the land tax is pegged directly to the price of the property, and that has inherently led to essentially displacement of homeowners. So the city of Austin is a perfect example where pensioners, for example, living on a fixed income who bought their home for $100,000, it's currently valued at $1.8 million. There's a lot of displacement going on purely because the land tax has become so excessive that they can't afford to live in the home that they have owned for most of their life. So there's a few little nuances that should be taken into consideration in that discussion around potentially moving away from stamp duty.
And that's why I always thought actually stamp duty, if you, for example, in well-located areas, if you increase the rate of stamp duty in some areas, that increased tax would only crystallise when you made the decision to sell. So when you got the benefit of the increased zoning or whatever. So for the people who may not want to move, well, they don't have to pay until they do. That might be a way to deal with it. But you're absolutely right. But this is the issue. If we can't get people to think recurrently about energy costs, maybe it's because they don't think recurrently about tax. And we already do have land taxes. They're called council rates. But most states peg them so they can't work efficiently to help people make the right decisions.
Now, we've only got a couple of minutes left. It's been such an interesting and informative discussion. But I guess just before we close out, I'm kind of interested to hear from both of you. The research covered a huge range of opportunities in terms of different measures, different next steps for research and action. If you had to kind of prioritise the top one or two, what do you think they'd be? Maybe I'll shoot to you first, Rob.
Well, I've also been watching the comments in the screen, and it seems that a popular choice among a lot of us goes to of a relatively simple thing to do would be to start doing, as they do in other jurisdictions, requiring disclosure of energy performance as part of a vendor or lessor disclosure at the point of a consumer making the decision about where they want to live.
Adam?
It's a good point, Rob. Look, mine's probably a little bit more provocative. Yes, I would love to see mandatory disclosure come in, and it seems to be, it will be using the NatHERS rating system. I think there's more work to be done in terms of developing or adopting a rating tool that actually measures the ongoing operational performance of the home, because the NatHERS rating tool is based on the design only. And there's evidence to show that the data that it's drawing on to produce those star ratings, it's based on past outdated weather data, and it's not looking forward to a changing climate. So that's an area of research that I would like to be a part of, with a particular policy focus on it.
Thank you both so much. I've just loved having this conversation with you and gained so much out of it. Thank you so much, and all the best for your future research, Adam.
Yeah, congratulations, Adam. A great piece of work. And to Stephen as well.
Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to share this research and have this discussion with you all.
And I'll just flag again that if you're interested in hearing about future AHURI webinars, do keep an eye out for AHURI news in your inbox. We'll announce future research and webinars. And also a reminder, we would appreciate your feedback. So you should get a short survey emailed to you later today. If you do want to share this webinar with any colleagues, it'll be on our website shortly. And you'll also receive it in an email for us to let you know that it's up. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.